Everybody, and welcome to Ask a Scientist. Today we're talking about environmental science with Monique Warren from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. We're happy to have you all join us today, and thank you for your time. I'm Sally Allen. I'm the Executive Director of the Livermore Lab Foundation, and we are so pleased to be hosting this series of events in partnership with Lawrence Livermore National Lab and with the Livermore Valley Joint Unified School District. So I just wanted to make a few quick introductions to let you know who's with us today, and then we will go ahead and get started. We have a lot of folks joining us today, so we're really excited. First of all, Susan Houghton, who you see on the screen, is going to be helping monitor questions that come in today in real time, and also sharing some of the screens with us. So if you have questions for Susan, you can be sending them through the chat. From the school district, we have Kevin Greer. He's the Director of Curriculum and Instruction. He's been a big part of helping teachers and students find out about this opportunity this spring. And from the lab, we have Nadine Horner, who's on the Community Relations team at the lab. And also, of course, our featured speaker today, Monique Warren. Thank you so much, Monique. We're so excited to get started. Let's go to the next slide really quickly. Today's presentation is the fourth and final in a series that we put together this spring on Ask a Scientist. And we are thrilled to have done it. And we've got copies or links to all of the YouTube videos and the recorded sessions from the prior Ask a Scientist events on the Foundation's website. So I would encourage everybody to check that out. And hopefully we'll have an opportunity to continue these in the future as well. A couple quick housekeeping items. As we have welcomed you into today's call, we have everybody muted, except for the speakers for purposes of keeping things in order. But again, if you have questions as we go along, please feel free to use the chat feature to send them to Susan, and we will try to address them. We had so many questions sent in advance, and Monique is very well prepared to address most of them. So we hope to get through them all today. If you are comfortable, also, please go ahead and turn on your video so that we can see you. It makes it feel like we're all a little bit closer together and able to interact during this time together. So thank you. So with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Monique Warren. She is an environmental scientist at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. She has been there about, what did Monique tell us? 5 years. 5 years, that's right. She lives in Stockton, so not too far, but not quite in Livermore directly. As you saw from the video before, she lives with her dog Roscoe, and we might get to see him as well today if we're lucky. And we noticed there's a little sign up behind you, Monique. What does that say in your background?
It says, "So happy we are together."
Oh, that's so nice. That's a perfect sentiment for today. We are thrilled that we're together today. That's a great start. So why don't we go ahead and hand it off to you. Maybe you can start off with a little bit about your background and how you got involved in this video series.
Yeah, so I have been working at the lab, like I said, like 5 or 6 years now. Actually, when I graduated from USC, I got an internship at the laboratory in the department I work at, the Environmental Restoration Department. And I was an intern for like 6 months, and then they hired me on full time. I guess they liked me, and they haven't let go of me since. And so I've just been really blessed to be able to be at the lab for so long.
Terrific. Okay, well, as I mentioned earlier, well, I might not have given you the number, but we got upwards of 40 some questions for you. I think people were really interested in the video that you produced. So thank you so much. I thought we'd start with just a couple general questions so we could get to know you a little bit better. And then I know we had some more specific questions related to the science itself. So how was, let's see. Maybe let's start with, who's your favorite scientist and why?
Yeah, it's so funny to see that question. I've never really thought a lot about who my favorite scientist is. I asked some of my colleagues if they have a favorite scientist, and they do. So I'm like, maybe I'm not a big enough of a nerd. So I've decided that as an adult, my favorite scientist is Yvonne Kegel. She's a NASA astronaut and a doctor. And I got to meet her in person last year at an event, and she is amazing. If you've never heard of her, you should Google her. She's done a TED Talk. She's so smart. She's a huge nerd, and she is just an amazing woman of color who is also an astronaut, which again, I just repeat myself because it's so amazing. So she's my favorite scientist.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. What do you love most about your job at the lab? And also someone asked, is there anything you don't like?
I think what I love most about my job is that I know we're making an impact. I know that we're protecting our community. And so the place where I work, we're there because there's contamination, which I talked about in the video. And it's important that we do what we do so that that contamination doesn't spread to the surrounding community, and it doesn't endanger the environment, it doesn't endanger people in their homes, and it doesn't endanger other water resources. And so that's what I really love about my job, is that at the end of the day, I know that I'm doing something to help others.
Very nice. Anything you don't like?
I feel like when you're a young engineering student, you think you're going to be out in the environment all of the time, and it's just not the case. You're at a computer more often than you think, because a lot of the things we do today are digital, which is very lucky in this time because I can work from home. So I think I didn't anticipate as a young student that working in the environmental field wouldn't necessarily mean I'm in the environment 24/7. So I wish I was outside more, but it's not a bad thing.
That's a logical answer from an environmental scientist, I think. Another question about your job, do you feel like it's hard? And how long did it take you to get where you are today?
I think there are definitely times when it's hard. Maybe when we don't have an answer to a question. Maybe there are times where we're confused by a problem or we don't understand why something's happening. Like there's a well at a site where when we put a pump in that well, it gets corroded really quickly. And so we are trying to figure out if there's a type of bacteria that's causing that problem. At first we thought it was a mixed metals issue. And so sometimes the answers are as clear as we would like. So I think those are the times where my job's hard, is like figuring out why things are happening, but it's also the part that I love because I'm an engineer. I want to solve problems. So even if the problem's hard to solve, it's still exciting.
Nice. Was there a specific reason you chose to focus on water as opposed to air or soil? Another student asked.
Sorry, I think the video froze, but
Sorry.
Maybe if it's still on me, there is a reason I decided to focus on water, and it's because of at USC, I got to take a course as a freshman student, a freshman seminar, and there was like 10 or 15 of us in this class. It was very small, it was very intimate, and at one point they had a Nobel Peace Prize winner who won the Nobel Prize in chemistry come and talk to us. And he had won the Nobel Peace Prize in chemistry for his science, and he had figured out a way to take carbon dioxide and convert it into fuel. And I remember walking away from that meeting so inspired, so curious, because he talked about taking carbon dioxide from the air and converting it into something usable, fuel. And so I was like, how does this not solve climate change today? How are we not just taking all of the carbon dioxide, all of our carbon emissions, and converting them to fuel already? So I remember leaving that meeting so excited about environmental science, about environmental engineering. And as I pursued environmental engineering more, it made so much sense for me to go into the water field, because all of my water classes were very exciting to me, which, you know, as a engineer, you hope a lot of your coursework is exciting, and it's just not the case. And so the water coursework was the most exciting to me.
That's great to know. That's actually, it was another question that was submitted, was sort of what were the most influential experiences you had in your schooling that turned you on to environmental engineering? So it sounds like that was really a turning point for you.
Yeah.
One last general question, and then we can move to the science questions. The student asked, how has doing your job and everything related to that affected your sort of way you live your life and your daily choices that you make?
That's such a good question. I believe that when you know better, you do better. And so knowing about our impact on the environment, knowing about the impact we can have on our water resources, it inspires me to do better in my own life. So I, of course, recycle. I, of course, try to minimize my waste. I go back and forth on paper towels. I'm trying to figure out if I can use bamboo paper towels because they're more sustainable, trying to eliminate paper towels from my life, just use cloth napkins all the time. And so I just know the importance of being as sustainable as possible. And so I try to implement that in even the smallest ways, like paper towels, in my life.
Great, thank you. Susan, is it okay for me to move into the next segment? I want to check in case anything's come up in the chat. Okay. So, and Monique, thank you so much. You've brought a number of slides with you today too to help illustrate some of your points in answering the questions. We had a number initially related to sort of the treatment of chemicals and contaminants in water. And so they're too long to list all of them, but I understand that the slides you brought today will help address kind of the bulk of those that came in. So I will let you share your screen there and maybe walk us through some of those.
Yeah, I hope it helps address the bulk of the questions. One of the questions off the bat was about how you consider making decisions as an environmental engineer, like how do you approach a problem? And so in school, I learned to first look at your givens. So the givens are what you know. So whenever you start a problem, they always ask you to list the givens. Maybe you're doing this in school right now. And so for me, as an environmental engineer working with groundwater remediation, groundwater cleanup, our givens are the water. So what's the quality of the water, what's in our water, and how much water do we need to treat? And so different people help with those problems. So to figure out what's in the water, I know one question asked specifically, how do we determine what's in the water? And that's through testing. And so we'll take a sample of water and we actually send it out to a different laboratory so where they have the equipment. And there's different types of equipment needed to test for different things in your water. So like there's mass spectrometry, there's we call it GC because it's a hard words to say, gas chromatography. And there's just different equipment needed to test for the different things in your water, like turbidity. And so we send it to a lab for them to send us a report of all the different contaminants in the water, all of their different concentrations, and then those are our givens, and that's the start of the problem. And so on the slide here, you can see like a conventional water treatment process, and some of the questions were about drinking water, and so I thought it would be interesting for us to see sort of a typical drinking water treatment process. And these slides are from the Flint water, from Flint, Michigan's water treatment plant. So I know Flint is probably something we've heard a lot about in the news, and how their water had metals in it. So if you are familiar with that topic, you'll know how important it is that their water treatment is good. And so I thought it would be interesting for us to look at their treatment process specifically for that reason. So the givens in this situation would be the inlet. So if you look at the first part where the sort of below the header where it says water treatment, you see they're taking water in from a lake. And that, I think that used to be the case for Flint. And then the issue started when they changed their water source from a lake to a river. And so it's just important when you're looking at water treatment in general to know where your water's coming from, know your source, and know the quality of that water. And when we say quality, what's in that water, what chemicals are in that water, what contaminants are in that water, what do you need to treat the water for? So that's like the first step. And I know another question talking about how do you, so if you have like multiple things in your water, how do you determine the process to treat all those things? So if we can go back to the water treatment process slide, you can see there's so many different steps in the water treatment process, and that's because we're accomplishing a different thing in each step. So when you're taking surface water, it might have like branches or twigs, large things that you need to remove, and so usually it goes through a screening. So we have like some sort of pre-screening thing to get rid of all those large, just basic things out of the water. And then once it goes from the screening process for drinking water, usually what you're going to do is add chemicals. So they'll add some type of chemical, and here at Flint, we can see they're adding alum, and it's a coagulant. And so what that's telling me as an engineer is they're adding this chemical to sort of produce flocks. And so it's the coagulation flocculation process. If you would only hear about this if you're in sort of water treatment, I guess. But basically, they're adding a chemical so they can create these like big particles that they can then allow to settle out of the water. And that's helping remove more contaminants from the water. So you dose the water with all these chemicals, and then you sort of do a slow stirring to produce those flocks. And then, and you want it to be slow so that the flocks can form. And we learned in like our different water treatment classes that it has to be sort of a slow stirring, and that's very important. And then it can go into the sedimentation basin, and at the sedimentation basin, basically the water is just sitting so that all the flocks can sort of fall out of the water by gravity, and then the water can then go into filtration. And so with like filtration, they might use something like granulated activated carbon, like I mentioned in my video, to filter out more contaminants. And so you just see there's a lot of different steps needed for drinking water in particular, and most water treatment processes in general, but they're each accomplishing a different thing via a different method. And we can go to the next slide. So I wanted to sort of highlight a few different treatment methods just so you guys can sort of see the science behind it. I know I mentioned granulated activated carbon. So there, the thing that's doing the work is adsorption. So there's a difference between absorption and adsorption. So absorption, you might see with like a sponge, where the sponge is taking something to the center of it. So it's taking the water to the center of the sponge. And so you can see for absorption, where under GAC, you can see the process there where the little black balls are going inside the circle. The adsorption is what we see with carbon, and that's different because it's going onto the surface. So for like carbon, what's happening is the contaminants coming, moving from the water, and it's sticking to the surface of the GAC. And so that's the process that GAC uses. And so we have granulated activated carbon, we have powder activated carbon, which is more fine. And so it's all dependent on your application for which one you would use. And then you also see reverse osmosis listed here. Reverse osmosis is very interesting, and it's sort of like, it'll get most things out of your water. So much to the point is like, if you put water through reverse osmosis, you would have to add things back in if you wanted to drink it, because it takes so much out of your water. So what happens with reverse osmosis is you're applying like a really heavy pressure for the water to go through a membrane, and the membrane has like really fine pores, so much that mostly water is just going through that membrane, and so you'll get fresh water on the effluent. And then you also have things like ion exchange, and ion exchange is really interesting and necessary because there are certain contaminants that can't be removed by like carbon. They need ion exchange because with carbon, you're relying on absorption, but there are things like nitrate that carbon can't remove. And so for those contaminants, we use ion exchange so that the little ion exchange resin beads can attract those contaminants by a different method. So we can move on to a different question. Oh, okay, so I like this question a lot because it asks about reactive contaminants. So at the lab, we actually do have some reactive contaminants in the water, and that creates a whole other problem because if you're treating water with reactive contaminants, you can create mixed waste. And so when you're using things like GAC, you're producing a waste. And I know it's like, it doesn't make a lot of sense to treat water and then sort of have to send something to a landfill, but it's part of the process. And so when you use up GAC, it can only absorb so much chloroform, or sorry, so much contaminants until it's used up, and then it doesn't work anymore. Sort of like your filter at home and your Brita filter, they tell you to replace it like every couple months. And so you can use your GAC, your carbon, for so long, and then through testing, we know when it's about done. And so at that point, we have to take that carbon out of commission, and then it becomes a waste. And dependent on what you've put on that carbon, you have to dispose of it properly. So sometimes it's a hazardous waste, but if you use it to treat water that has things that are reactive, like tritium, it's a more radioactive waste. So it's a whole other issue, but I just thought it was really interesting that somebody asked about reactive chemicals in your water.
Very cool. Oh, let me make sure. Are we ready to move on to the groundwater questions, or did you have any more slides that you wanted to address with the treatment?
I think we can move on.
Okay, great. So we had a number of questions related again to aquifers, which was the subject of the video that you did. I'm also curious, maybe in the chat, if students can share if they tried Monique's experiment at home. It'd be interesting for people to share what their experiences were like. But there were, I guess, that's my guess, is maybe that is the case, because there were a lot of questions kind of related to the different aspects of the aquifer that you described in that experiment. So mostly related to sort of the space between the gravel, how different liquids would leak all the way through, and sort of how pollution makes its way through those. So I'll hand it back to you to walk us through some of those questions.
Yeah, if you can go back one slide, I think I had, or maybe a couple slides. Yeah, that one right there. So one of the questions regarding an aquifer was sort of about how I had set up my aquifer. So in my aquifer, I had shown gummy bears as gravel and a layer of ice cream as like the clay. And that question was asking, there was a question asking why I had set it up that way, and why wouldn't the gravel be on top of the confining layer? And so what in the real world, the earth determines how things are layered, right? And so it's all about how things came to be geographically. And so my hydrogeologist and geologist cohort at work could probably explain this to you better. But what we do at the lab to determine how things are sort of laying on top of one another in layers on our property is we drill like a borehole. We drill into the ground, into the earth, and we take out that core as it was in the earth, and then we're able to see sort of what each layer is, and that helps us to figure out, okay, so 100 feet down, there's a layer of clay. So we know that if we only install our pumps 100 feet in the earth in that area, we're not going to be able to pull a lot of water, because that clay isn't really going to let the water come through very well. But 200 feet in the earth, there's a layer of like silt, and there's also some gravel, and so that silty, sandy gravel will allow the water to come through. And so that's what the hydrogeologists and geologists do, is that they go out and they sort of do a survey and figure out sort of where things are by drilling into the earth and getting core out. And then they are able to model on the computer sort of what they think the property looks like based off of the what they've seen through doing experiments like that. So you can sort of see something like this picture you have here, where you're able to see where the confining beds are, where the rock is, and sort of where the aquifer is based off of drilling down into the earth. There was a question about if an aquifer could overflow, and I love that question because I'm dealing with that right now. That case is called an artesian aquifer. So an artesian aquifer, an artesian well, sorry, is a well that's been drilled into like a confined aquifer. In that case, you see like the flowing artesian well on the left. So because of the pressure, the water is able to flow naturally to the top of the well. So for confined aquifers, when you drill into a confined aquifer, you'll see that effect. So I have wells that Artesian and Tracy. And so we have to have a special setup for those wells. Otherwise, that water will leak, and that's not good because it's contaminated water. And so we have to take special measures when we're designing those wells so that they're properly equipped. I'm just looking through the other questions.
Yeah, I think there was a good question about, do you think there will ever be a time when we run out of groundwater due to drought or drying out of aquifers?
That is a very good question. If you can go to my next slide. So it really depends. So water is different all around the world. And right now we're looking at the water crisis. That's something that's super interesting because each area, like California, we've been in droughts a lot, right? I know we've gone through seasons of droughts, but there's other areas of the world where water is more plentiful and they're not seeing such like droughts like we do. And so it really depends on where you are and where you live on whether or not water is a problem. Somewhere where water is definitely going to be a problem is Australia. Australia uses a lot of groundwater. If you think about it, Australia, the rain that Australia sees, they lose a lot of that rain to evaporation because of the weather, because of the temperature. And so you can see in this picture here how much groundwater they use. The sort of colors tell you how much groundwater they use in compared to surface water. And so the sort of red areas, they're showing more dependence on groundwater than surface water. So if they use up all of that groundwater and they're so heavily dependent on, they're not going to have water left, right? And so that water is a storage of water. It's not an endless supply. And so Australia invested a lot of money because of this huge problem that they have on their dependence on groundwater. They invested billions of dollars, guys, billions of dollars, like $13 billion on creating desalination plants because what they do have a lot of, because they're an island, is salt water. They're surrounded by the ocean. And so because they know, okay, we're going to come to the end of our groundwater at some point. We don't see a lot of rainfall. We don't see a lot of recharge for our groundwater. And we don't have like tons and tons of surface water. So what we do want to do is figure out our future. And so to set themselves up for the future, can you go to my next slide? They created they built a lot of desalination plants. So you can see here on this slide where they've made desalination plants sort of on the lower end of Australia. And so some people were very upset about this because desalination is problematic because it requires a lot of power, a lot of energy, because you're using things like reverse osmosis, like I talked about, where you're pushing high pressure water with a high pressure through a membrane. And so it's a very costly process. It takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of power. And so that means it's costing the people of Australia a lot of money to get this water from the ocean. And so I thought Australia was such an interesting example of like using salt water. And other places like Israel, where the temperatures are high, where it's very arid, countries like Australia and Israel, like they're trying to think creatively about their future of water because of their dependence on groundwater. Can you go to my next slide? I think I might have, oh, okay. No, this wasn't about Australia, but.
Okay, great. We had a couple questions submitted related to drinking water. Does that line up with your next set of slides?
Yeah.
We can go there.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Okay, these, just so folks know, a couple of the questions. What different pollution scenarios cause the worst damage to the ecosystem? Another great question was, if every city is supposed to provide clean water to its residents, why is drinking water cleaner in some cities and less clean in others? And if you live in a city with bad water, how do you live knowing that your water might be more contaminated?
Yeah, these were all really great questions.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought what would be interesting is being able to give you guys the power to figure out where communities maybe near you are having problems with their water. I thought the question about why do some communities have clean water while others don't was super interesting, because when I was in college, I thought the people who had it worst were like developing countries, you know, people in small villages that didn't have access to clean drinking water. But the problem is closer to home than you might think at first. There are tons of communities, hundreds of communities in California alone that don't have access to clean drinking water. I am privileged to, you know, go to my tap and be able to drink the water that comes out of it. There are a lot of unincorporated communities in California. And so unincorporated communities basically are communities that aren't tied into like a municipal treatment system. So they don't have sort of like the same hookup that you probably have in your own home. And a lot of these unincorporated communities are typically communities in lower income areas. And so there's so many different problems that comes with that. So on this map, you can see all of the red stars are communities. Some of them are schools. Some of them are trailer parks, where they have determined that that community's water is out of compliance. And this map is available to you if you were ever wanting to look at a different area. But if we can go to the next slide, I sort of zoomed in on the Livermore area, so we can see communities near Livermore that are out of compliance. And I was concerned because I saw there were several communities near Stockton that were out of compliance. So if you can go to the next slide, I saw that there is a school, Redwood School in Stockton, that is out of compliance. And so that means that they've found contaminants in their water recently. And there is sort of a judgment to this, to whether when a water is determined to be out of compliance, I think they have to be in compliance for a good year before they're taken off of this list. But this is very recent that this community was determined to be out of compliance. If we can go to the next slide. So I wanted to sort of see for myself where this school is located. So what it turns out is this school uses a well, and you can see on the map that this school happens to be surrounded by like a lot of farmland, a lot of looks like vineyards. And so what I think probably happened is these vineyards are using pesticides. And when you look at what was found to be in that school's community supply, if you could go to one more slide over, it's a contaminant known as TCP. And so what's the problem with this pesticide is, one, TCP was known by the distributors of this pesticide to be harmful to humans, to be problematic. It's a byproduct of their process, and they knew about it. And instead of doing something to remove it at the end of their process, that would cost money for them to remove this compound, they left it in and called it an active component. And so calling it an active ingredient means, when you call something an active ingredient, it means that it's important to the process. It's important for the pesticide to work, that this contaminant be in the pesticide. But it was a lie. It's not true. It's really bad. And so I'm sure a lot of the areas surrounding this school are using pesticides that have TCP in it, and because they're doing that, it's seeping into the well water. And because that community is surrounded by, you know, people who are using this pesticide, their water is being contaminated by that pesticide. And it's a really sad problem to have, but it's the case with a lot of land like this, where maybe a home is using well water as their water supply, and they're surrounded maybe by agriculture, and they might see runoff from like fertilizers. Fertilizers use things like nitrate in them, and if you get nitrate in your well water, it can cause health issues for you. And so I encourage you, if you ever are curious about the water in your area, this is just sort of a systematic way you can look at it. So you can see where there are problematic areas, and then if you look at that area, you can see what's surrounding that, just like I did, where I saw that there's farmland, and you can see sort of where these chemicals are coming from.
Thank you so much for sharing that example, Monique. I think it's really a very tangible way to understand kind of how you go about your work too in looking at contaminated water. We had a number of questions just in general about environmental engineering that I think your experiment generated. Building off of this example you just gave, sort of related to, what can we all do to help mitigate environmental pollution, encourage others to do that as well. And people mentioned things like car washing or mobile pet grooming services, and how those impact, groundwater and our drinking available water. So maybe you can, I think your next slides address some of those questions.
Yeah, I love those questions because you're thinking, it showed me that students and maybe your teachers and parents are thinking very practically, like what are the things in my world that I do that can impact groundwater, that can impact water resources. So washing your car, that's definitely going to have an impact. Mobile pet grooming businesses have wastewater, and so they have to consider where they're going to discharge all of that water they're using to wash dogs. And so for the instance of car washing, something very practical you can do and encourage your parents to do is to use a car washing business. So they use less water, like a car washing business. I have like a Kelly's Car Wash down the street from me. It would use less water for me to go there than to do it at home. So there's one way you can save water and conserve water is by just going to a physical car wash. That would be much better than doing it at home. And they're also going to have a better way to discharge the wastewater from the car wash to the sanitary sewer instead of the stormwater sewer. So when you're doing a car wash at home, the problem comes with the water you're using. And so if you're not using a biodegradable soap and you're using products that have bad chemicals in them, if you're doing that on like your driveway, that's a non-permeable pavement, the water can't seep through your driveway, then that water is going to run off of your driveway and go into the stormwater sewer. And so when things go down like the gutter, down the stormwater drain, that water goes straight to a surface water. It's going straight to the ocean, straight to a river, and it's not getting treated. So it's really important for things to go to the sanitary sewer because that means it can go to a wastewater treatment plant. So like when you flush your toilet, when things go down your sink, those things go to a wastewater treatment plant, and it goes through a lot of different processes to remove all those chemicals before it goes to the ocean. So they make sure it's meeting regulations by the law before it goes to the ocean. And so that's why it's so important when you're washing your car at home. Number one, use a biodegradable soap. Just so if anything runs off while you're washing your car, it's not gonna harm the environment and harm fish, harm birds, harm wildlife that interacts with that water, with that wastewater. And if you're gonna wash your car at home, wash it on like your lawn, so that, I know it sounds kind of sort of, when in my video, I talk about not spilling things on the ground, but if you're gonna wash it, it's better for you to wash it on your lawn because you're probably gonna have less impact doing it that way, because then the soil is gonna soak up the water. You're using a biodegradable soap, so it should be fine. And then you're not allowing things to run off of your driveway into the stormwater sewer. And then another case I thought about was like, for your parents, they might change their oil at home, their car oil. And the problem here is you don't want to dispose of used oil, like by pouring it out on the street, by pouring it out on the gutter. For the same reason, you don't want to use a non-biodegradable soap. That's super harmful for the environment. So it's important you dispose of your oil properly and that we're not just spilling oil on the ground. That's a lot of what happened at the lab where I work, is things that were sort of solvents, things that were cleaners, things that were used for equipment were spilled on the ground. And that's why we have the contamination we're dealing with now. And so if your parents are changing their oil at home, if you see one of your parents changing their car oil at home, keep an eye on them, make sure they're disposing of it properly and not just pouring it out on the ground.
We had a couple of quick questions come in on the chat while you were speaking, Monique. One was about, what about fertilizer on the lawns and the impact there? And why doesn't rainwater drain to a wastewater treatment plant? Why does it go directly to the surface water?
Yeah, those are good questions.
It's Nadine from the laboratory. So Monique, I just want you to clarify your comment about things being spilled at the lab, how long ago that was?
Yeah, sorry, that's not like recent. It's historic, it's legacy contamination that I'm talking about. It's back before when the lab was a naval air base. Before Lawrence Livermore National Lab was there, it was a naval air base. And so the solvents they use to clean airplane engines, those are the things I'm talking about being spilled on the ground. I'm not talking about today and the good people at the lab today. But for those questions, so when cities are built, we have to factor things into consideration, environmental problems, right? Like we're going to see rain. And so do we want to treat all the rainwater? That's a great question. And so instead of doing that, we have sewers set up, right? So we allow things, instead of just flooding our streets with water when it rains, we allow the rain to go into the rainwater sewer so it can feed into the ocean. And the assumption is that it's only rainwater, right? So the problem comes with that assumption when people put things that aren't rainwater into the gutter that aren't, that's not clean and ocean ready. So that's why rainwater doesn't get treated and doesn't go to a treatment plant. I think there are a few communities where they might have sewers that do feed into treatment plants. But to my knowledge, most of the communities in California, our rainwater sewers aren't going to a treatment plant.
Okay, great. I'm going to let you finish out your slide deck so that we can make sure that you have an opportunity to share those. And then we're starting to get a few more questions in the chat that we can open it up to.
Yeah, so one really cool question was about recycled water and why we don't use recycled water more. And I think it's gotten a pretty bad brand name. There were some initiatives to use more recycled water, but I think they did a bad marketing plan for that recycled water because they called it toilet to tap. So I think calling water toilet to tap probably gave people a bad association with it. They're like, gross, I don't want to drink what's gone into my toilet. You probably don't want to drink what's gone into your toilet. But I think that doesn't give people a proper understanding of what recycled water is and the intense processes it goes through so that it is clean enough to use again. I think recycled water actually is really cool. And you could also call it reclaimed water. It's water we're reclaiming. So instead of just throwing away a bunch of water, think of it like your cans. Instead of just throwing away your cans, you're like, no, I don't want to just create more waste. I want to reuse them. I want to recycle them and turn them into something else. So that's what we're doing with this water, right? We're not just saying, oh, I'm going to flush this water down my toilet and not care about it anymore. I think instead we should reframe our minds and think, instead of just throwing away all this water, I'm going to reclaim it because the drought is coming. The drought is going to come again, especially in California. And we're going to recycle this water and use it in a new way. We're going to treat it so that it's not gross anymore and that so it's usable and use it in a new way. And people are doing that. If you ever see purple pipes indicate recycled water. So if you see a purple pipe, maybe at your school uses recycled water to water its lawns, or a park. There's some parks that will use recycled water to keep the grass green. Golf courses use a lot of water, so it's really good when a golf course uses recycled water instead of just regular water. And so there is a lot of signs in place because you should not drink recycled water because recycled water is not necessarily potable water. Potable water means you can use, like the water coming out of your sink, water coming out of your shower should be potable. It should be drinkable by you. But recycled water is not potable water, and currently it's not legal to reuse water for potable reasons, to reuse water to send to like people's homes. We're not doing that on a large basis. But I do think having recycled water in general is a very sustainable practice. So I thought that was a really cool forward-thinking question. Some of the questions about environmental engineering were sort of like, what else do environmental engineers do? I talk a lot about water because I'm super passionate about water. Water, we all drink water every day. We all need water to survive. So water is super important to me. But there are a lot of different things environmental engineers do. And I wanted to help you guys think more creatively about that. There's a lot of innovation in environmental engineering. one cool example I saw was this billboard in Lima, Peru. I was in Peru last year. I really wish I knew about this billboard when I visited Peru last year. I would have gone to seen it. There's this billboard that was a project, and they're taking the humidity in the air. There's a lot of humidity in Peru, in Lima, Peru. They're taking the humidity in the air and they're capturing it to produce water that's drinkable. So I thought that was super cool and super innovative and such a good picture of the future of environmental engineering. There was another project Bill Gates did on my next slide, where they're asking engineers to think creatively in their communities. And so there's this really cool machine this engineer came up with to take, it's gonna be gross, but to take feces, to take, you know, your poop, and turn it into drinking water for communities to use. And I know it sounds really gross. Just like toilet to tap sounds really gross, but it's drinkable water. It's not poop water. It's water that's clean and usable. And when you're limited on your water resources, when you're limited on how much water you have, you do have to think creatively, and you do have to get over being grossed out about where waters come from. And so I see somebody shaking their head. No, it's drinkable water. And so I just thought these two examples were really cool, because they're showing you how creative we can be and how creative we should be in engineering, especially in environmental engineering, because at the end of the day, environmental engineering is about people, is about our environment, our world. And so we all need to think creatively about how we can make this world a better place, because the earth is the only thing we have right now. And just like on a side note, there are cool things in environmental engineering too that are outside of this world. I know NASA has jobs for environmental engineers. Like if you're thinking about how to build a world on Mars, how to build a habitat and community on Mars or the moon, you're gonna need environmental engineers to do that, because you're gonna need water. You're gonna need a sustainable environment. And so if you're curious about space and stuff, I know that there are avenues that way. If you're somebody who cares a lot about social justice and water rights, there's jobs for environmental engineers in environmental justice. And so I think it's super important for those communities that we saw on that map that don't have access to clean drinking water, that those communities get access to clean drinking water. There's so many legal issues that come up with water. And so environmental law, environmental justice is very, very important. And so if social justice is something that sparks something in you, there's a place for environmental engineering there as well.
That's fantastic. Oh yeah, and this was your last slide, had a number of the resources that you mentioned in all of your comments. Is that right?
Yeah, I just wanted to give links to everything I was showing. It's, you know, the student in me, you have to have a references slide.
Thank you so much. And a reminder, we are recording today's session, so those will be available to everybody when we send that out to you. Thank you so much, Monique. Susan, I don't know if you've had a chance to see some of the questions. I'm happy to do them if not while you were sharing your screen.
Well, we have one that has come in, and I'll be happy to live in launch afterwards, and that is about the town of Hanford, Monique, that if you've ever been to the town of Hanford, I guess their water smells like sulfur, and could you explain that? And like when you're taking a shower and drinking sulfur at Hanford.
So I'll be honest here. I looked a lot into Flint, Michigan, because I was so ready for everybody to be up in arms about why Flint still doesn't have clean water. I did not look at Hanford. I don't know what Hanford's water resource is. I don't know if they changed recently, how long it's been smelling like sulfur. That sounds very problematic. And I don't know if there's like sulfur reducing bacteria in their resource, and maybe that's why they're seeing those things come through. There's a lot of different elements that could come into play. So I'll just reiterate that it's really dependent on your resource. So if you're changing from one resource to another, if you're switching from a lake to a river, you have to take that into account. And so when water treatment plants are set up, they're set up with a certain resource in mind. They're built with that resource in mind, and they're built to treat that water so that it's acceptable to the regulation, to the law, and they're not necessarily interchangeable. That's not like, oh, we can just tap into this other resource and this treatment process will work for that resource. That's not always the case. That resource might be poor, a really poor quality compared to your other resource. And that's where you see problems like this. So I would be curious if they're seeing, maybe we used to treat 80% groundwater and 20% surface water, and now we're treating 50% surface water and 50% other water. So if they're switching up their resources, that could be a source of the issue. Maybe somebody's discharging into the near or into the resource, and so there's different reasons they could be seeing things like sulfur.
Okay, we have Sally, we have two more questions that have come in. One was, could you talk about the specific considerations you use when you make decisions on how to solve an environmental problem?
Yeah, so when you're solving a problem in general, I always go back to school. So you look at your givens, and you also want to look at your assumptions. You want to make really clear any assumptions you're making when you're solving a problem. Sometimes you do have to assume things to solve a problem. And so I think you want to be as strategic as possible. So just make sure you know, okay, what are all the things I know about this problem? What do I have to assume, and how will that impact my result? And having a clear process for, a stepwise process for your getting your answer.
Two more, Sally. We have one about water. Can it be turned into energy?
Yeah, water can totally be, that's called hydropower. Water can totally be used for energy. That's a whole other area of environmental engineering, renewable energy, wind power, solar power, water power. Water can totally be used for energy.
And then looks like we have one more about wastewater and where it goes. Does it end up in the ocean?
Yeah, so at the end of the day, we're treating, what should happen is when you flush your toilet, when you take a shower, that water is going to your local wastewater treatment plant. I've toured wastewater treatment plants before. They smell really bad because they're treating wastewater, but that water goes through a rigorous treatment process. And I know like Hyperion is a very famous wastewater treatment plant in LA. And they discharge, you can see exactly where they discharge. You can, when you're driving to Hyperion, you can actually see where their outfall is, where they're discharging into the ocean. So most of the time, wastewater treatment plants are discharging to a surface water. So surface water includes a lake, a river, an ocean.
We have another question Haley sent in, that how do scientists and engineers decide on which solution to try? So maybe you could talk a little bit about the decision-making process. Is it trial and error, or what research you're using to go forth?
Yeah, that's such a smart question. I think at the end of the day, you have to consider a lot of different factors. Sometimes the best solution isn't like the snazziest solution. Sometimes the best solution is one that's cost effective. So that a lot of the times in engineering, you have to take cost into consideration. That's why things like desalination aren't super prevalent. Like Australia spent billions of dollars and people are very mad about that. So you have to consider the cost, and you have to consider what's readily available. Is this thing, do I need a piece that's not available on the market? There's a lot of solutions in research that are super cool. There are a lot of people who are researching things that have a lot of promise, but they're not practical yet. They aren't things, they might have like a treatment media like carbon that they're working on in research, but I can't use it yet at the laboratory. And so you have to have a solution that is ready for use, right? So there's so many different factors. So you have to like sort of go through all those different factors. And to me, the best solution is one that makes the most sense with all those factors into consideration, one that's cost effective, one that's readily available, and one that is effective, one that works.
We have one more. Why is water good for us, and how many glasses of water do you drink a day?
That's such a good question. I try to drink the recommended 8 glasses of water, 8 cups of water a day. I have a water bottle that tells me at what time to drink the water. I haven't used it yet today. That's a good reminder for me to drink more water. And water, a lot of your body is made up of water. And so we should all just, after this meeting is over, go have a glass of clean drinking water. It's your privilege to have a glass of clean drinking water.
So we probably have time for one more question. Can pollution coming from one aquifer spread to another?
Yes. Yeah. So a contamination plume, I did the octopus arms in my video and talked about how a plume can spread. But it's really dependent on like what that plume is made of, how concentrated it is, how large that plume is. There's a lot of different factors, but contamination spreads, and it can become a small problem, can become a bigger problem, can become a bigger problem. And so, yeah, that's why the hydrogeologists at my department are so important, because they help us quantify things we can't see, the things below the ground. So hydrogeologists are like water geologists, right? They're like a subsurface geologist. And so they're helping us figure out what the ground looks like below the ground, the subsurface.
Great. Susan, thank you for your help with those additional questions. Students, if your question did not get answered today, feel free to send them still to info@livermorelabfoundation.org, and we can track down Monique, make sure we get those answered for you. Again, the recording of this will be on our website next week, and it'll have all the references to the different resources she shared with us today. Really exciting. Thank you so much, Monique. One last question I had for you is, do you have any parting advice for students that joined us today that are interested in maybe pursuing a similar path, either educationally or in their careers?
Yeah, I would say I was so encouraged reading all of these questions. I shared some of them with my colleagues, and we were all so excited about you guys. We were like, the next generation is going to tackle a lot of problems. You guys know about things that are just now being talked about in our community. Somebody asked about PFAS, which is a chemical that's called an emerging contaminant. And we're just now talking about PFAS a lot in our community. And so I'm so excited about you guys. I'm so excited I got to meet you on this Zoom call, because I know you guys are super smart. You're driven. You're on a Zoom call in the middle of the afternoon talking about environmental science. So my advice to you would be to keep that energy, keep that enthusiasm, keep that excitement for the earth, and stay curious. Make sure you are always asking questions. And that's sort of what engineers do. We try to further our understanding so that we can solve problems. Don't accept the first answer, right? Keep pushing for further answers and stay curious. I'm so excited about you guys, and I know you guys are gonna be solving problems maybe my generation caused today. Maybe we've created some pollution that you can help clean up later on. But yeah, that's my advice. Make sure you stay curious.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time, Monique. It was a real treat to get to learn more about what you do at the lab. And I'm sure you've inspired a lot of the students out there. That's really what the Livermore Lab Foundation was designed to do. And we hope to see many of you in the future, either working at the lab or in other science and engineering careers. So with that, I think we are about at time. And if anyone's interested in following for future events, please go to our website. It's just livermorelabfoundation.org, and we have a newsletter that you can also sign up for to follow us and our activities with the lab. So thank you again, everyone, for your time.
Thank you, Monique.